everyone, welcome to History on Trial. This is Dr. Tracey McCarthy, psychologist, attorney, and educator. We're going to turn our attention quickly to the poll that was just taken. We're going to go over the results of the poll, and then we're going to look at this dynamic of cultural artifacts that speaks to the questions that were posed for the poll. Okay, let's look at the psychology of identity poll. We have 52 votes cast for this particular poll, and the first question was, are African Americans descended from the ancient Caucasian Khazar tribes or Khans? Also, number 2, are there any social or cultural artifacts that support a biological descent relationship? So we have 52 votes cast. We have 6% of those votes indicating a yes, a large chunk, the majority, 56% indicating no, then 13% indicating maybe, and then another large chunk of 25% indicating that they do not know. We're going to turn our attention to cultural artifacts. So we're looking for cultural artifacts related to that number 2 question. We're looking for a relationship between African Americans and Khazars. We're looking to see, is there a relationship based upon cultural artifacts? Now, the cultural artifacts we're going to be looking at are linguistic cultural artifacts and what would be considered social organization artifacts. And so cultural artifacts are just basically anything that human beings create that can provide some sort of information about the culture, whether you're talking about the creator of the artifact or the user of the artifact. And also, culture is something that is passed down from generation to generation. Now, there is a question about these artifacts that we're going to be looking at because they are linguistic artifacts. There's a question about whether this linguistic artifact based upon social and cultural identity is actually something that's been passed down or something that may have been more recently adopted. And so that's a question that's out there. Now, some of the questions that we deal with, there has been confusion about the answers, and we've been looking at potential answers for a number of things for a few years now. And so one of the things to keep in mind is that if you didn't have clarity about something in 2019, 2018, 2020, you might want to start to get that clarity for 2021. So we're going to look at some of these cultural artifacts related to Eurasian culture, Khazar culture. This word is spelled a couple of ways depending on what language you're looking at. And one of the first things that we're going to look at, this linguistic artifact, is this Turkish title that a number of men who have been identified as African American, they may not see themselves as African American, they may see themselves as American Indian, they may see themselves as Moorish, they may see themselves as Hebrew, they may see themselves as African. Whatever the identity is that the individuals might have, there are a number of individuals under one of those umbrellas that identify by the Turkish title of Bey or Beg, and Bey being spelled a couple of different ways, which you can see on the screen. Now, this is related to the Ottoman Empire. And this is a title, it's a title of respect. So it's a title of reverence. And so it's also related to this idea of rulership or governance. And so again, we're coming back to that idea related to Tsar and Czar. There's quite a bit of focus on rulership and leadership. And this is another one of those titles that falls in line with this. And this comes from the same culture that you get that Tsar and Czar from. So this is all one big cultural artifact in terms of linguistics, and you're going to see a number of them that fall under the same umbrella. You've probably also noted that a number of individuals who identify as African American, who have been identified as African American, also have taken on the title or been given the title or the name of Khan. And so you see this pretty frequently. It's also pronounced Cain. And so depending on what language you're talking about, you may see a different way of pronouncing it. But you can see that there is a way to pronounce it in Old French, Medieval Latin, and then you also have Turkish language. And so one of the things to make note of is you have individuals under that umbrella identifying with Bey and with Khan. These are two cultural artifacts that point to Khazar Eurasian culture. And here's additional information related to Khan. And you can see that this is the title of sovereign princes in Tatar or Tartar. Depending on what you're looking at, you may see it spelled different ways. And so this literally means lord or prince, also sovereign, also ruler. Again, you see that they are saying in the medieval Greek, they're related to Cain or Canes. You also see Shan or Chan. And this is going to be important as we go along because you're going to see that this relates to yet another Eastern culture. What would be helpful would be to have just general conversations about these linguistic cultural artifacts and why those who've been identified as African American men, why those individuals in particular would be taking on these linguistic markers in terms of social positioning. And so if these are not cultural artifacts that were passed down from generation to generation, how were they acquired? And why is there an adoption of something that is Eurasian versus something that is African versus something that is indigenous to the Americas? Why this particular part of the world? It's a very specific part of the world and a very specific culture. It is noted that this part of the world that we are talking about is also biblical, and so it's related to Abraham. And so then you tie back to that whole issue of Sarah with the Sar and the Czar. So that is important to remember, that area, and we've talked about that before. That Turkish area, that Eurasian area is a very biblically laden area. But it would be helpful if people were just having regular everyday conversations about this, and if things were not shrouded in so much mystery and esoteric stuff. So anyway, let's move on to Czar. And so we've talked about this before, but you also have Czar, which is also related to Khazars, and you can see that it's related. You see in the Gothic, you see that Khazar, you see in the Greek Khazar, and you see sometimes a T in front of it for Old Slavic. If you look down below, you also see additional notations where you see the translation in certain languages just being that ZAR, in addition to the CZAR or the TSAR. And so you have that Czar dynamic going on, that Khazar dynamic going on. The question is, what's the relationship between this group of people and this cultural artifact and African Americans? And why is there that connection? What is that about? Is that a cultural artifact that's passed down from generation to generation, or did it come about, this adoption come about in another way? And this is just another notation with SAR, and this time it's the TSAR. What's really noteworthy is this Sham, which is a derivative or alternative form of Khan. And not only is this a derivative form, this is commonly in previous times applied to rulers of the Tatars and the Mongols and to the Emperor of China. And so this is a cultural artifact that relates back to, again, to Asia, and very specifically to China. And so this word Sham also relates to Ham in the Bible. And so when you have a combination of Sham being in the alternative Khan, this really tends to even give more credence to this relationship, because of course you have the relationship between Ham or Ham or Kam and Khan or Cain, Canaan. And a really important question that goes along with how this came to be a cultural artifact in African American culture or in American culture is, what is the understanding that people have when they are identifying in this way? Are they understanding themselves to identify as Mongols? Are they understanding themselves as identifying as Turkish? Are they understanding themselves to be identifying as Eurasian? And here you see additional cultural artifacts in the form of surnames. And so you can see this surname Khazar has been migrating around quite a bit. And so you see that with the 1Z, you have this name being most prevalent in Iran and the highest density in Iran. With the 2Zs, you see the surname being most prevalent in Morocco with the highest density in Morocco. And so there's definitely a relationship between Khazar, the people known as Khazars, and Iran and Morocco for certain. The question, however, is what is that relationship? And is this a migration dynamic, or is this a conquest dynamic? What is the dynamic that gave rise to these surnames being so prevalent in Iran and also in Morocco? One thing that makes it very difficult to get to the truth about a number of issues in terms of culture is that you have some groups of people that insist on a particular historical narrative, and they are pretty unyielding when it comes to those cultural narratives. And then you have another dynamic where certain individuals like to put everyone that may look alike, slightly alike, under a particular umbrella and really be unwilling to let them out from under that umbrella. And so often that comes with a belief that they are a particular identity, and therefore anyone else who looks or seems substantially similar must be from that same identity. What is noteworthy is that we're going to go through a collage here. What is noteworthy is that those men who are lumped under that umbrella of African American, they come from so many different haplogroups. And so you have everything. Interestingly, you have the oldest haplogroup among this group, and then you have the youngest or the newest haplogroup. And so that oldest haplogroup would be A, and then that youngest haplogroup would be the R's. And so it's really interesting that people have been making this assertion for so long that this cultural group is actually genetically the same. They are not genetically the same. And so you have everything from, you have A and you have the B haplogroups. That's that father, son, father, son. You have quite a few E, and then you also have quite a few R for that umbrella. And that alone tells you that these are not all the same men. And so that creates quite a bit of confusion, because there has historically been this narrative that all of the men are the same, and the only diversity would be having European fathering or African fathering. And the story is a little bit more complex than that. But this is very important because a number of things are starting to be revealed regarding the importance of these genetic markers. And so again, if you don't have that clarity in 2020, you probably want to get that clarity in 2021. And so again, you have this diversity in terms of the blood groups, the A, B, O blood groups, and then also those haplogroups. And then you have a lot of diversity in terms of phenotype that actually point to some of this other diversity, because you can look at some people and you can see features in those individuals that look substantially similar to features of groups of people that are all over the planet. And so we're just going to look at some of the diversity in terms of these men who have been placed under this umbrella of African American. And also these are some of the men who also identify according to some of those Eurasian Khazar titles that we just went over. of the problems with answering the questions for the poll is that there has been insufficient general public education related to the ancestry of the people who are in the Americas. And so people have been struggling with just trying to figure out who they are, struggling through all of this historical revision, struggling through all of the esoteric stuff that tends to shroud the history. And then you have adoption of cultures that may or may not be accurate adoptions of cultures. Then you have, in some instances, what appears to be the passing down of culture, the way culture goes from generation to generation. The question is, which one are we dealing with? And so one thing to keep in mind related to this Khazarian issue, that Eurasian history issue, is that you have a couple of other things that support the idea that a number of people who are identified as African American are essentially from that part of the world, and not because of some instance of slavery, human chattel. We're not talking about that. We're talking about that's the origin of that particular genetic background. And so for the R haplogroup, that is the area that certain R haplogroups are supposed to be originating from. Again, this is the newest, this is sort of like the infant haplogroup for males, but there is a large grouping from that area and also spreading across Europe from the east to the west. And so you also see that here in America, in the Americas, the United States. We talked about Dominican Republic, Jamaica, and the Bahamas also. You'll also see indicators in Barbados. And also among American Indians. And so there's a high rate of that R among American Indians. And that would also be a part of that, what's been considered a Mongol invasion of the Americas. The issue is that though the Mongols that may have invaded may not have, in terms of phenotype, always looked like people would expect them to look based upon the people that are in the space right now in Eurasia. So there's always this push to believe that what you see today is what was there yesterday. And so when you look at America, you can see that what was here 200 years ago is not the same as what you see now, or what was here 400 years ago is not what you see now. And so you can't always look at what's going on right now to give you certain indications about exactly what was going on in the past. Again, there has been significant replacement demography going on, people moving in, pushing people out, taking on identities, and that's where we get to that question about all of this ish. You know, why are there so many ishes in terms of identities? You've got everything from Flemish to Danish to Scottish to Irish, and we have quite a bit of Blackish related to all of this, because the quote-unquote Black identity is running through a lot of these issues. And so the question is about all of these issues. We're not going to name all of them, but there are a lot. The question is, when people say they are an ish, what's the real identity? Because ish indicates that there is a distinction between what comes before the ish and the ish. And so if someone is Danish, where are the real Danes? Remember, knowledge is power. Take care and see you soon.